The Aztecs by Nigel Davies. Chapter 1. The Long Migration. With their world in ruins and their gods departed, the Aztecs who survived the Spanish conquest sought consolation in the glories of their past. To the once proud conquerors, now poor underlings, no traditions were more hollow than those of their early wanderings, when, once before, they had been hard-pressed and humble, and yet had survived. Nearly a century after the conquest, a prince of the royal blood called Tezosomoc wrote his version of these early happenings. And in the year 1609, I, Don Hernando de Alvarado Tezosomoc, who am a grandson of the person who was the great king Moctezuma the Younger, and who am descended from his noble daughter, from the body of the princess, my most loved mother, Doña Francisca de Moctezuma, whose husband was Don Diego de Alvarado Juanitzin, my most revered father, a man of noble birth. These are they who engendered me, and in all truth I am their son. What they, the ancient nobles, stated and affirmed in their writings, all occurred, all is true, and contains no lie. They only set it down without invention and without falsehood. And also for this reason I, Don Hernando de Alvarado Tezosomoc, certify and affirm the story of these elders, for it is not only from the months of just a few that the account comes which I now give. What is related I attribute to those already named, to those same elders who put it in order. I keep my trust by my own resolve. From their well-loved lips I learnt what the revered kings and nobles told who lived then, and whose doings I recount, and whom may our Lord God pardon. The Mexicans, or Mexica, are not unique in the obscurity of their early myths and legends. Such ambiguities, however, make this part of their story harder to relate. The events of the early Mexica migration, as told in codices and chronicles, have long been the object of critical studies. The first of these, made in the 18th century, tended towards a literal interpretation of the original accounts, partly symbolical or mythical in nature. The Mexicans were thus credited with the most remote origins, both in space and time. Following a more critical approach by 19th century historians such as Orozco y Berra, scholars then went to the opposite extreme, interpreting the tale of the migration as being nothing but mere myth. The original Mexican home of Aztlan, an island surrounded by water, was for them nothing more than a reflection of the situation of the great capital which they later founded in the Valley of Mexico. Students of the subject were thus left to wonder whether the Mexican homeland was to be sought in Mexico City itself or nearly 2,000 miles away in distant California, mentioned in certain early texts. However, more recent reappraisals have sought to draw a balance, finding in the old legends a certain ring of truth. Whether they concern ancient Greeks or ancient Mexicans, such sagas are often linked with actual happenings and with real people. The first crucial question regarding Mexican antecedents naturally concerns their place of origin. Curiosity on this point was not confined to post-Hispanic times. The great Aztec Emperor Moctezuma I, wished that those who had remained behind in their traditional home of Aztlan might share in the dazzling triumphs of his empire, at that moment in about 1450, reaching the summit of his power. He accordingly sent for as many magicians as could be mustered, and 60 in all were found. Furnished with sumptuous gifts of mantles, precious stones, and feathers, they set forth and reached a place reputed to be the birthplace of their god, Huitzilopochtli. Here they found a demon who turned them into birds and monstrous beasts. Thus transformed, they took wing towards a remote destination. Having resumed human form, they found themselves among kinsmen, who arrived in canoes and asked them in their own language who they were and whence they came. They were then taken to a very old man who was himself related to the deity. He asked them who were now priests of the god. In reply, he was naturally given the names of men of whom he had never heard, including the Emperor Moctezuma himself, whom had seen them thither. The same old man promised to take them to the mother of their god, Huitzilopochtli. They encountered various adventures on the way, including immersion in treacherous quicksand, from which the dotard rescued them with one finger. He proceeded to scold them severely for their wanton habits and luxurious ways, since they had become great and powerful, far removed from the Spartan life which they had left behind them in Aztlan. They finally came into the presence of the mother of Huitzilopochtli, now a very ancient hag, so hideous that she resembled something straight from hell. They told her the story of the spectacular creation of the Aztec Empire by her sons' chosen people. Know that the 4 previous kings, before Moctezuma I, lived a life of hunger, poverty, and labor, and paid tribute to other provinces. But now the city is prosperous and free, and has opened up and secured for itself the ways of the coast and of all the earth. Mexico is now lady and princess, and queen of all the cities, which now obey her commands. The magicians gave her the magnificent presents which they had brought. She, seemingly unimpressed, replied that she herself was poor and miserable. Instead of wondering at their dazzling accomplishments, she prophesied only doom. The Mexica, in turn, would one day be overthrown, as they had overthrown others. With these fell tidings, the sorcerers returned to the Emperor Moctezuma. Now, while later investigators may tend to eschew the aid of magic, the problem has nonetheless attracted their attention and displayed their divergences. Padre Duran, writing in the late 16th century, tells how he consulted elders who gave different opinions as to Mexican origins. Some said that they had emerged from springs of water, others from caves, and yet others maintained that they were the offspring of the gods. He mentions that many native records were burnt by the first friars as works of the devil. Consequently, it was impossible to know the whole truth. Such a conclusion holds good today. The learned Padre then hazards his own guess as to Mexican Indian origins, suggesting that they came from the lost tribes of Israel. His theory tended to become widespread and to die hard. He produces curious arguments to support his view, quoting from the prophet Hosea. He tells how God, as punishment for their sins, condemned 10 tribes to be perpetually cowardly and pusillanimous. Since the Indians had allowed themselves to be conquered by Cortez and a mere 300 men, they had displayed precisely these characteristics. Thus, ipso facto, they must be the lost tribes. For the same chronicler, certain of their religious rites, such as sacrifices made on mountain peaks or in caves, ritual cannibalism, or the offering of children, also described in the Bible, confirm the connection. He perhaps does the Israelites an injustice in suggesting that they shared the ancient Mexican propensity toward ritual consumption of human flesh, though his comments on infant offerings are more correct. Possibly these innocents fared better as victims of the Mexican rain god than when passed through the fire to propitiate Moloch. Even today, differences have persisted as to Mexican origins and as to the location of Aztlan. Some place it as far off as the southern United States, others as near as the Valley of Mexico itself. Certain writers have insisted that it never existed at all. Some have also favored the coast of the Gulf of Mexico as a point of departure. Most modern observers, however, following more closely to the established traditions as expressed in the chronicles, agree in focusing their attentions in a northwesterly direction. The question still remains, how far distant from the Valley of Mexico should Aztlan be sought? Any answer to that question must be linked to the whole problem of the cultural development of the Mexica. If, as would appear, they possessed a modicum of civilization when they reached their ultimate habitat, they could hardly have been living in the remotest wilds. If, on the contrary, they were mere nomads on their arrival, the verse would be true, and their place of origin should be sought farther afield, beyond the pale of Middle American civilization. The sources which tell the most about the Mexica route agree that, after leaving Aztlan, the first places visited were called 7 caves, Chicomostoc, and Curved Mountain, Culhuacan. The question of the whereabouts of Aztlan in these 2 localities can only be studied as a whole. The 3 are mentioned together by practically every source, but often as being synonymous rather than separate. For instance, Aztlan Chicomostoc or Aztlan Culhuacan. If they were thus not one single place, this at least implies that they were to be sought in the same area. Aztlan itself is described simply as being surrounded by water. The Mexica lived there as fishermen, making great use of boats. As to what we know of the 7 caves, and here in Guinahuayan, the rock is called Chicomostoc, which has holes on 7 sides, and from there came forth the Mexicans, carrying their women, when they came out of Chicomostoc by pairs. That was a fearsome place, for there abounded the countless wild beasts established in the area, bears, tigers, pumas, serpents, and it is full of thorns, of sweet agave, and of pastures. And thus, being very far off, no one still knew later where it was. Aztlan is specifically the place of origin of the Aztecs or Mexica, but the 7 caves are of legendary importance not only for this tribe, but also for those countless others who came to the Valley of Mexico before them. According to the traditional accounts, each had originally emerged from the 7 caves. In this way, it was the mythical place of departure for the whole mass of migrants who descended onto the Valley of Mexico in the mid-12th century, after the collapse of the Toltec Empire, and may perhaps be regarded as a general place of assembly as much as a Mexica starting point. Curved Mountain, or Culhuacan, the third locality mentioned in connection with these early wanderings, is also of deep significance, as its Toltec connections represent the great cultural traditions of the past. The city of the same name in the Valley of Mexico was later to play a great part in the history of the Mexica, as the connecting link between them and the former Toltec Empire. As to the actual location of these places, so closely interrelated, there exist 2 principal modern viewpoints. Firstly, Dr. Paul Kirchhoff considers that the original Culhuacan is to be identified with San Isidro Culiacan, some 170 miles northwest of Mexico City, and beyond the modern town of Querétaro. The 7 caves would lie not far to the east of this, and Aztlan a little to the west. Secondly, Professor Wigberto Jimenez Moreno, while agreeing that the 7 caves lay to the northwest, thinks that they were located nearer at hand, some 60 miles distant from Mexico City. He, however, places Aztlan much farther away, in a lagoon called Mexcatitlan, on the coast of the modern state of Nayarit, far to the northwest. In the midst of this is an island which corresponds closely with codex pictures of the original Aztlan as an inhabited place surrounded on all sides by water. There is still a place called Aztlatlan nearby, which would have been situated within the original lagoon, now reduced in size. However, notwithstanding the remarkable coincidences as to name and geography offered by this far-off site, it might appear more logical to seek for the starting point of the Mexica, and for a collecting place for the other migrant tribes, nearer to their final home. For one thing, the standard of culture of many of them was fairly high when they first arrived in the Valley of Mexico. Accordingly, while there is now a wider acceptance of the notion that the general place of mustering, the 7 caves, was relatively near to the city of Mexico in a northwesterly direction, the 2 leading viewpoints are still at variance as to the location of Aztlan, whence the Mexica themselves set forth. The question therefore remains to be answered. Was Aztlan situated on the far-off northwest coast, or was it also relatively near to the Valley of Mexico? This raises the question of whether there were, perhaps, 2 Aztlans. The closer one studies Mexican origins, the more one feels that although the Mexica were distinct from other tribes, one is not dealing with the migrations of one homogeneous tribe, and that 2 main groups, quite different in nature, had joined forces. The early Mexica tended to present 2 distinct sides to their nature, contrasting the civilized and the nomad. In the records, they are sometimes depicted as semi-savages clad in skins. Sometimes they are written as erecting stone buildings. It is thus very possible that the original Aztec clans were later joined by 3 others of a lower cultural level, coming from much farther afield. The presence of 2 types of migrant is strongly suggested by the order of the god Huitzilopochtli to his chosen people to change their name from Aztec to Mexica, or Mexicans. This latter name probably derives from the Nahuatl word Metzli, meaning moon. According to what the ancients tell, when the Aztecs came from Aztlan, they were not yet called Mexicans, but were still called Aztecs. And it was after what we have already told that they took this name and were called Mexicans. According to this version, it was Huitzilopochtli who gave them this name. Then he immediately changed the name of the Aztecs and said to them, "Now you shall not call yourselves Aztecs any more. Now you are Mexicans." Then, when they took the name of Mexicans, he painted their ears and also gave them the arrow, the bow, and the little net. And thus the Mexicans shot with arrows very well at what they saw on high. This presentation of bows and arrows reinforces the notion of the joining of the 2 groups, one nomad and one more civilized. The bow and arrow were par excellence the nomad weapons, whereas javelin thrower Atlat was characteristic of the more civilized peoples. Possibly, therefore, the different opinions as to the location of Aztlan are not totally irreconcilable. It seems likely that the more cultured half of the whole tribe had already lived for some time within the bounds of the ancient Toltec civilization, even if they originally had come from farther afield. Their early habitat, Aztlan, was very possibly not too far remote from the area of the Seven Caves, the place of muster, nor from the Valley of Mexico, the central valley in which Mexico City now stands, itself. For instance, the island of Yanitzio on Lake Pátzcuaro corresponds to the usual description of Aztlan as a confined space surrounded by water. These people, already semi-civilized, were probably joined by another group, more nomad in stature and arriving at this time from much farther away, perhaps the distant northwest. But names repeat themselves frequently throughout Mexico, and such nomad newcomers to the group perhaps also came to conceive of their original and more distant home as Aztlan. There may well therefore have existed more than one Aztlan. Accordingly, it is probably a fruitless task to go much further in pinpointing the exact whereabouts of the place. The name is not only legendary, making it hard to fix in space or time, it must equally be appreciated that Aztlan is as much a concept as a place. After all, the future Tenochtitlan was to be in effect another Aztlan, a center of population by lagoon waters, though it was never to be given that name. The Mexica probably set out on their migration in about AD 1111. It was to be a long journey before they finally settled in 1345. The original migrants were poor and few in number. They proceeded under the guidance of 4 priest rulers or Teomamas, meaning literally bearers of the god. They had an idol called Huitzilopochtli, who was borne by 4 guardians who served him. To these he spoke very secretly of the events of their route and journey, telling them of all that was to happen. And this idol was held in such awe and reverence that no one else but they dared to approach or touch it. And it was kept in an ark of reeds, and up to this very day there is not one of these natives who knows or has seen its form. And the priests held it up as a god, preaching to their peoples the laws that they had to follow and observe, and the ceremonies and rites which should accompany their offerings. And in this they did in every place where they set up their camp, after the manner of the children of Israel during all the time when they wandered in the desert. The chroniclers' accounts of these happenings are visibly colored by their familiarity with the Old Testament. The information given by pictorial codices is of necessity more cryptic, though they name more of the places visited. At the outset, the Mexica were divided into 7 clans called Calpuli, and they led the typical life of a wandering tribe. Thus, for a considerable time, the Mexicans wandered through Chichimec territory. When they established themselves in a good place, they remained for some 20 years. When they were well off, they settled in a place for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, or 15 years. When they were not well off, they settled for some 20 or 40 days. They set out for Cuestacat, Ichocayan, and for Icamac. Everywhere they gave names to the land. For food and sustenance, they ate meat, beans, amaranth, chia, chiles, and tomatoes. Where they stayed long enough, they built temples and erected the dwelling place of their god, Huitzilopochtli. At longer halts on their journey, they not only constructed temples, but at times even a court for the ritual ball game which formed an integral part of ancient Mexican culture. They used stone, and at a later stage even made simple fortifications. They used sowed maize, sometimes harvesting the crop, and sometimes leaving before it had reached maturity. And they adopted the seemingly heartless custom of abandoning their old people at suitable stopping places. But a journey undertaken on foot over the arid and mountainous country of this region must have been arduous, and there was probably no alternative. The wanderers at times suffered hardship, going hungry, thirsty, and almost naked. But they consoled themselves with hopes of better times that lay ahead, and their God was lavish in future promises to his chosen people. Because we shall proceed to establish ourselves and settle down, and we shall conquer all peoples of the universe, and I tell you in all truth that I will make you lords and kings of all that is in the world. And when you become rulers, you shall there have countless and infinite numbers of vassals, who will pay tribute to you, and shall give you innumerable and most fine precious stones, gold, quetzal feathers, emeralds, coral, amethyst, and you shall dress most finely in these. You shall also have many kinds of feathers, the blue cotinga, the red flamingo, the tzinitzian, all the beautiful feathers and multicolored kako and cotton. And all this you shall see, since this is in truth my task, and for this I have been sent here. All of this was told them by their priests, who learned of it in dreams sent by the god. In addition to rather haphazard agriculture, the Mexica wanderers lived by hunting. Their original lagoon habitat abounded in aquatic fauna, but on leaving Aztlan, they came to depend more on land animals such as deer, rabbits, birds, and even snakes. Since they only grew crops periodically, their diet must have been mainly meat. Neither their way of living nor their social organization was thus purely primitive. The predominance of the four priest rulers implies the existence of a certain hierarchy, perhaps of a rudimentary class structure. It should be added that even at this stage they spoke Nahuatl, the language of the more civilized peoples of central Mexico. Moreover, they knew the use of the ritual calendar of ancient Mexico, with its sacred cycle of 52 years. They had even been initiated into the arts of human sacrifice. Certain accounts rightly stress the more nomadic characteristics of the Mexica at this time. Our general picture, however, is of a migrant group, few in numbers, poor and ill-provided, but not altogether uncivilized. By the virtue of their being, social organization, agriculture, language, and religion, they are far removed from the nomads, some of whom had preceded them into the Valley of Mexico. The latter are invariably depicted as dressed in skins, dwelling in caves, and worshipping rudimentary gods. Above all, unlike the Mexica, they did not practice agriculture. Thus, the Mexica definitely come within the pale of Middle American civilization, though possibly situated at the farthest extreme of its cultural spectrum. The Toltec Empire, whose glories the Mexica would one day emulate, was in a state of incipient dissolution at the time when they set forth from Aztlan. Such convulsions may have even occasioned their departure. The empire, whose apogee lasted from the mid-10th to the mid-12th century, had been the ruling power in the region through which the Mexica were now passing. There exist many doubts as to the actual area which the Toltec physically controlled. However, their culture and influence were spread throughout the length and breadth of Middle America, stretching even as far as Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula. The famous remains of Chichen, in fact, reproduce on a more grandiose scale many of the main features of the Toltec capital of Tula, and are rich in representations of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, the great deity of the Toltecs. Tula finally fell towards the middle of the 12th century, for reasons probably connected with barbarian incursions from the north. The Toltec collapse, like the Roman, left a power vacuum, and their empire was thereafter nostalgically revered as the upholder of stability and civilization. Those accustomed to the world as they had ordered it were left dazed by the Toltec fall. Suddenly, their legendary priest ruler departed to disappear in the east. And when these things had happened, Quetzalcoatl was now troubled and saddened, and thereupon was minded that he should go, that he should abandon his city of Tula. Thereupon he made ready. It is said that he had everything burned, his house of gold, his house of coral, and still other works of art, the marvelous and costly things. All of these he buried. He hid there in treacherous places, either within the mountains or in the canyons. And moreover, the cacao trees he changed into mesquites, and all the birds of precious feather, the quetzal, the blue cotinga, the red spoonbill. All these he sent away beforehand. Taking the road before him, they went away to Anahuac. It was into the fluid situation created by this great debacle that the Mexica were to step, actually visiting the abandoned and desolate capital of Tula long before reaching their final destination. They themselves belonged to the outer fringes of Toltec civilization, rather than to the nomads who partly contributed to its doom, and may even have served as Toltec mercenaries. This is not to suggest that at this moment the Mexica were either important or prosperous. They were still a group of poor wanderers who had so far developed a propensity to cause trouble to their neighbors, but little else. Of the events of the first 52-year calendar period, between the departure of the Mexica from Aztlan and from the initial place of muster at the Seven Caves, and continuing till their arrival in the vicinity of Tula, about 40 miles to the northwest of Mexico City, we have little knowledge. After gathering at the Seven Caves, they lost themselves in the mountains, the woods, and the place of crags, and just as their fancy pleases, the Mexica wander. So reads the brief text in Nahuatl appended to the illustration of their wanderings depicted in the Codex Azcatitlan. Such events as occur are told in a context more magical religious than political. They mostly concern the relationship of the tribe with their god Huitzilopochtli and are recounted by chronicles plainly well versed in the Old Testament. As to the places visited en route, the two main sources tend to differ. They occasionally fought battles with their neighbors and even took prisoners, whom they would sacrifice. A picture has also survived of the forebearers of the god sacrificing women in the early stages of the migration. The migrants at this point clearly suffered from certain dissensions. The first incident of its kind occurred when the Mexicas settled under a certain tree, which then split in two. This was interpreted as a terrible omen. The god Huitzilopochtli told his priests that, as a consequence, part of the tribe must separate from the remainder. Only the most virtuous were to be his chosen few. They were to proceed on their way, leaving the rest behind. This was the first break away from the main body. Others were to follow. A further one occurred almost at the outset, also implying some kind of religious schism. The god Huitzilopochtli had a sister who became a sorceress, using charms and incantations to gain special authority over animals, and particularly over such dangerous pests as snakes, scorpions, centipedes, and deadly spiders. These, at her behest, would bite anyone who opposed to her wishes. Huitzilopochtli, unwilling to countenance unorthodox opposition to his rule, instructed his people simply to abandon her in the night, together with her adherents. Quote, "Thus forsaken, she wept bitter tears. When the sister of Huitzilopochtli, Malinashok, awoke after they left her sleeping, she stood up, wept, and said to her supporters, 'O my fathers, whither shall we go, since certainly my elder brother Huitzilopochtli has left us by stealth? Whither will the villain have gone? Let us search for the land to which we must go, since everywhere there are peoples already established.' Once again, the dissenters were banished from the tribe. They made their way to a place called Malinalco. We shall hear more of them later when they tried to rejoin the main body of the Mexica, already established in the Valley of Mexico. Huitzilopochtli now again lectured his people, reminding them that it was only by virtue of their courage that he would lead them to greatness, and not through the mere use of magic. Because your God says that he did not come to cast spells upon the nations or to bewitch them, nor to bring them to your service by such means, but only by their spirit and the valor of their hearts and arms. By such ways does he think to make his name great, and to lift the Mexican nation to the clouds." The main body journeyed onwards and reached a place called Coatepec, Hill of the Serpent, which is usually described as being near Tula. Here they celebrated the first new fire of the migration, marking the beginning of a fresh 52-year cycle in the ritual calendar of ancient Mexico. It was not until the fifth new fire, centuries later, that they were established in their promised land. Thus, in terms of time, most of their journey from Aztlan still remained before them. However, as far as distance was concerned, at Coatepec, they now stood only some 40 miles from their final home, but the road thither was to be circuitous. It was therefore more of a wandering than a migration on a fixed course. The main event in Coatepec was the birth, or rather the rebirth, of the god Huitzilopochtli, probably marking the final assumption of authority by his adherents. The story is told by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, perhaps the greatest of all the Spanish chroniclers. Writing between 1548 and 1585, he transcribed into the original Nahuatl and also into a Spanish version all that he had learned from a great body of informants. Every aspect of pre-Hispanic life is covered, including detailed accounts of all known fauna and flora. His third book relates to the origin of the gods and begins with what happened in Coatepec, which he himself states to be near Tula. Here lived a devout woman named Coatlicue, Skirt of Serpents, who was the mother of 400 sons. One day she was sweeping in the temple on the hill, and once, as she swept feathers, as it were, a ball of feathers descended upon her. Then Coatlicue snatched it up and placed it in her bosom. And when she had wept, when she came to take the feather ball which she had placed in her bosom, she found nothing. Thereupon Coatlicue conceived. Her 400 sons were not overjoyed by the prospect of a happy event so miraculously inspired. On the contrary, they adopted an attitude of righteous indignation against their seemingly wanton mother. Her single daughter even advised them to kill her before her shame became known. And their sister, Goyal Shauki, said to them, "My elder brothers, she hath affronted us. We must slay our mother, the wicked one who is already with child, who is the cause of what is in her womb." However, one of the 400 played traitor and told of their plans to Huitzilopochtli, still in his mother's womb. Thus forewarned, he made it his business to be forearmed. On birth, he emerged equipped with shield and buckler and brandishing the famous serpent of fire Xicuatl, symbolic thereafter as the weapon of the god. The 400 brothers also prepared for war. They were in war array, which was distributed among them. All put in place their paper array, their paper crowns, their nettles, painted paper streamers, and they bound bells to the calves of their legs. The bells were called Oyoali, and their darts had barred points. But Huitzilopochtli ignited his serpent of fire. With it he pierced Goyal Shauki, and then quickly struck off her head. It came to rest there on the slope of Coatepe, and her body went falling below. It went crashing into pieces in various places. Her arms, her legs, her body kept falling. In the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, there is a magnificent statue of this goddess in decapitated form, not as a fragmented head, as is sometimes thought. Huitzilopochtli then completed his task by routing his 400 brothers. Only a very few escaped. His arm, the serpent of fire, became a sacred relic. When the Aztec capital was in desperate straits, as a last resource, a lone warrior was sent against the Spaniards, armed with the hollowed weapon. This time it was of no avail. In Coatepec, Huitzilopochtli, now in truth supreme deity among the Mexica, gave orders through his priests that a nearby river should be dammed. Once the dam was made, the water flowed and spread all over the plain, forming a great lagoon. This they surrounded with willows, poplars, and sabines. It became filled with copperas and reed mace. It began to be stocked with every kind of fish upon earth. Marine birds came, such as ducks, geese, herons, widgeons, with which the whole surface was covered, as well as many other kinds of fowl, which the lagoon of Mexico City today maintains and feeds. In other words, the Mexica were seeking to reproduce the conditions of their former home, Aztlan, as well as those of their future island capital. Coatepec thus magically transformed into a kind of paradise. The Mexica lived most contentedly, devoting much time to the pleasures of song and dance. Such were the delights of the place that voices were raised to suggest that they should settle there forever. This, however, did not at all suit Huitzilopochtli. His chosen ones had as yet been insufficiently tried, and he became irate. In anger, the god replied to the priests and said, "Who are they who thus wish to set aside my resolutions and place objections in their way? Are they perchance mightier than I? Tell them that before tomorrow I will take my vengeance of them, that they may not dare to give opinions on what I have determined and for which I was sent, and that all may know that only me they shall obey." The rebellious leaders were found dead the next morning, with their hearts cut out, as in the most usual form of human sacrifice. The watchful god now told his people to destroy the dams and let the river resume its former course. With the lagoon waters released, the reedlands began to dry, as well as the reed mace and the trees and all the freshness. The fish and frogs started to die, as well as all the other reptiles engendered by the water, and which these people used for their nourishment. The marine birds began to go away and leave the place as dry and somber as it had been before. Quite apart from the information thus provided on their route and their life, such stories are of great symbolic significance. Much is implied both as to the composition of the group and as to its beliefs. Once the two original and disparate elements had joined forces, one semi-civilized and one nomad, it is natural to assume that the Mexica proceeded on their way as a single composite body. But the truth was less simple, and it seems that during the long migration, smaller groups joined the main nucleus from time to time. Equally, others fell away. The first incident of this kind, which I have already mentioned, involved the splitting of the tree, when Huitzilopochtli divided his faithful adherents from the remainder. The second episode involved the abandonment of the god's sister, and accounts emphasize that her supporters were also left behind. The third division took place in Coatepec. It clearly took the form of an uprising against the established leaders, again with the involvement of a sister of the god. It seems likely that the first story of separation refers to dissensions between the supporters of Huitzilopochtli and those of other gods, at a time when the former was not fully established as the supreme deity. On the other hand, the two subsequent incidents, both affecting so-called sisters of Huitzilopochtli, probably represent differences between clans, each led by followers of the god himself, or even clashes between different factions within the god's own personal clan, with which he was always to be specially associated. What emerged from such conflicts was a more homogeneous group, among whom Huitzilopochtli's own clan came to dominate the remainder. This clan in its turn was controlled from now on by an inner ring of the gods' priests and devotees. The true origins of Huitzilopochtli, the special god of the Mexica, whose cult bestowed upon them the status of a chosen people, are obscure. The Orthodox accounts depict him as the presiding deity of the whole tribe from the very start, though each of the 7 clans had its own patron god. Like Jehovah, Huitzilopochtli guides his people through the medium of his priests, leading them on to the promised land, exacting in return the virtues of courage and obedience. But in studying ancient Mexican history, one often discovers that a situation prevailing at a much later date is projected backwards in time. If a certain deity predominates at the end of a long migration, the chronicles assume that the same god was paramount at the outset. Huitzilopochtli is described as in command right from the start, yet his birth in Coatepec is described as if he had not existed before the Mexica arrived there. An element of contradiction is clearly present. It would therefore seem much more likely that the original leader called Huitzilopochtli was not a god but a mortal who had died. Mention is made in more than one source of a human leader of that name. One may thus suppose that a hero of early times became first a legend, then a deity. In fact, it was nothing new for a human leader to bear the name of a god. The unique cult of the god Huitzilopochtli was probably consolidated by his birth in Coatepec. But it was really more of the case of a god being promoted rather than created. The name Huitzilopochtli derives from a combination of hummingbird Huitzilin and the word for both left and south, Opochtli, and can best be interpreted as the hummingbird of the south. The hummingbird itself is a symbol of the greatest antiquity in Mexico. This tender little creature was intimately linked with human sacrifice, occasionally even depicted with his beak boring out of the blood of the victim. He was also associated with rain, since he makes his appearance in the rainy season. Moreover, Huitzilopochtli's birth in Coatepec is in more than one sense a rebirth. It not only marks the assumption of supremacy by his supporters over the whole Mexica tribe, in addition, his very nature was transformed. He virtually discards his prosaic existence as a mere fisherman's god or an undistinguished earth deity, to become instead the glittering lord of the daylight sky. The usual interpretation of this rebirth is that his sister and 400 brothers symbolize the moon and the stars. In routing them, Huitzilopochtli personifies the action of the sun at the beginning of his daily course. In his new and spectacular role as Lord of the Daylight Sky, he is associated with the color blue and with the south. The hummingbird element in his name represents the fallen warriors who, in the guise of this bird, were believed to accompany the risen sun on his daily journey. He thus equally becomes the god of war, embodying the Mexica will to conquer. Huitzilopochtli is therefore, like his chosen people, a combination of the old and new, of sedentary settler and the nomad invader. Both concepts are fundamental to an understanding of the Mexica themselves. In the main, as an incarnation of the fiery orb, it is the dynamic element in the god which was to predominate. For the Mexica, the older and more pacific gods now yield precedence to their militant patron deity, with his imperious insistence on war and strife, whose victims provide his daily nourishment of blood and fill his paradise with slain warriors, ready to accompany him on his celestial journey. On leaving Coatepec, traditionally in the year 1168, the Mexica proceeded to Tula itself, by then in a state of utter desolation. The Toltecs themselves were now fleeing from their stricken capital, though it would not appear that the Mexica played much part in its destruction. Their stay in Tula itself was brief. Thereafter they resumed their wanderings, and accounts vary as to the places actually visited as they entered the Valley of Mexico, the plain ringed by mountains where they were finally able to settle. One important place where they sojourned was Xaltoca. This city was then situated in the midst of a lagoon of the same name, and must have accordingly seemed like home to the Mexica. At the same time, it was one of the leading powers of the Valley of Mexico, and capital of an extensive region stretching some distance to the northeast. The Mexica were now beginning to come into contact with the leading peoples of the valley. However, though this part of their journey lasted for nearly a century, information on their life is not plentiful. It must be assumed to have continued in unaltered form as they went from one city to another, and as each generation succeeded the one that went before. The small tribe continued to move from place to place, hunting and fishing, sowing and reaping, as the circumstances permitted. And if their stay anywhere was prolonged, building a temple to the god Huitzilopochtli. The Mexica were now only a few miles distant from their final home, even if many tribulations still lay before them. And the scene which confronted them as they approached was naturally very different from that which meets the eye of the modern visitor. The Valley of Mexico itself constitutes the heart of the whole central part of Mexico, and lies midway between the two seas at an altitude of over 7,000 feet. By definition, it is not a valley but a basin, since it lacks any natural outlet. Measuring some 60 miles from north to south and 40 miles from east to west, it covers a fertile area about 2,500 square miles. It is ringed by kind of a giant horseshoe of mountains on the east, south, and west sides. Of these, most impressive are the snow-capped volcanoes to the southeast. The benign climate of the region has often been described as an eternal spring, for great extremes of temperature are unknown. In the winter season, frosts do occur in the early morning, but are quickly dispelled by the warming rays of the sun. In the hotter weather of April and May, which precedes the 4 months of rains, the thermometer may rise to the mid-80s at noon, but at such an altitude the nights are always cool. Nowadays, the general aspect of the valley is arid and dusty for part of the year, owing to the drying up and subsequent drainage of the greater part of the former Great Lakes or lagoons, which covered much of its surface. At the time of the conquest and before, they numbered 5 and were fed by springs and short streams from the surrounding mountains. These would still have been heavily wooded when the Mexica appeared on the scene, though deforestation had already taken its toll before the arrival of the Spaniards, as each successive civilization cut down its quota of trees. Another major difference that would strike the visitor of today, if he could miraculously be transported back to the pre-Hispanic past, would be the absence of the ordinary domestic beasts, the horse, donkey, pig, and goat, that have since become so much part of the landscape. Ancient America possessed no flocks and herds like those of the Mongols and other nomads of the Old World, and before Cortez, only the turkey and dog were present to serve in the needs of man, together with the llama and the guinea pig in parts of South America. Wildlife was, of course, more abundant than today, particularly on and around the lagoons. The vegetation, too, was different. The two principal types of tree that now predominate in the valley are the pepper tree and the eucalyptus. Whereas the latter was naturally a late arrival from Australia, the former originated in Peru, not Mexico, as its Spanish name implies. But whereas in Mexico many things changed rapidly, others remained much as they were. Not only were there adobe houses, little different from some of those in the villages of today, but the principal crop, then as now, was maize. Nowadays it tends to be grown more on the lower ground, whereas formerly, when the plow was unknown and the only available instrument was the koa or planting stick, it was easier to sow on the slopes of the hills and mountains, where the coating of grass and weeds was less thick. Then, as now, moreover, the peasant diet was based on the combination of 3 plants, maize, beans, and squash, that have been predominant in Mexican agriculture since time immemorial. The valley at this time, in the 12th century, would have already been studded with villages and even cities, though none approached the proportions of the capital which the new arrivals were one day to build. The Mexica themselves, having left Xaltocan, stopped at a further series of resting places and then came to Tenayuca. This had become the capital of the nomad Chichimecs, who had occupied the Valley of Mexico after the fall of the Toltecs, and who had formed an empire of their own, which reached its height from about 1200 to 1250. These people originally appeared as mere cave dwellers dressed in skins, soon intermarried with the survivors of the civilized Toltec world and adopted more sedentary ways. Like so many famous places in the annals of Mexico history, Tenayuca, the place where walls are made, is now an undistinguished outer suburb of Mexico City. However, unlike others, it can at least boast of the substantial archaeological remains. Apart from its imposing pyramid, with its many superimpositions, the ruins of Tenayuca are distinguished for their wall of serpents, such as was later to be constructed around the great temple in the Mexica capital. When the Mexica arrived at Chapultepec, a little before AD 1300, the situation might perhaps be compared with that of Italy, say a century after the fall of Rome. The valley had been invaded by a series of tribes, some of which, like the more advanced of the Goths, had previously resided within the confines of empire, and had adopted relatively civilized ways. Others, however, were semi-barbarous, though equally disposed to learn the ways of their former masters. The principal culture center was still Culhuacan, not to be confused with the legendary Old Culhuacan, where the Mexicas started their journey. The name Colhua probably derives from the Nahuatl word coli, or grandfather, denoting people with forefathers, that is to say, of high descent. Culhuacan was par excellence the surviving Toltec city of the region, and memories of the Toltecs still tended to be treasured as those of a golden age. But Culhuacan also persisted as an important political entity. Like Ravenna after the fall of Rome, it represented a renewal of Toltec civilization, as much as a survival. In such disturbed times, it was Culhuacan that upheld the principal legitimacy and continuity. However, by the time the Mexica arrived upon the valley scene, it was no longer dominated either by the surviving Toltecs or by the nomad invaders, whose tenure of power had been brief. The lead has since been assumed by later arrivals, boasting of a fairly high level of culture, having already largely adopted Toltec ways. Accounts, perhaps apocryphal, suggest that the nomad ruler gave lands to these newcomers and married them to his daughters, just as his own followers on their arrival have taken Toltec royal wives. Of the various invading groups, two were outstanding in importance. One of these, the Alcolua, went to settle in the region of Texcoco, along the eastern shore of the lagoons. The main center of the tribe was originally Coatlichan, now a village, until recently renowned for the huge monolithic statue which was found there. After being hewn out from the rock to which it was still attached, the enormous block of stone was taken to Mexico City and now stands at the entrance to the National Museum of Anthropology. It is popularly known as Tlaloc, the rain god. However, since it sports a skirt, it may rather represent his sister, the water goddess. The second people of great significance among those who preceded the Mexica in the area were the Tepanecs. They settled more to the west of the lagoon, and their principal city was Azcapotzalco, place of the ant heaps, now also a mere suburb of Mexico City. Like many others, it was not founded by its most recent occupants, the Tepanecs, but could boast of a long tradition going back nearly 1,000 years more. The historical importance of these Tepanecs cannot be overemphasized. They were to dominate the Mexica during their early years in their final home. It was under their tutelage that the latter were to be transformed from an impoverished tribe into a nascent great power. The Aztecs were to build on these foundations. It was more from the short-lived Tepanec Empire, rather than from the Toltecs, that they were to learn the art of empire building. In the Valley of Mexico and the surrounding region then, no single master ruled, since the Alcolua and the Tepanecs were only beginning to emerge as the superpowers of the region, facing each other across the lagoon. Politics presented a scene of almost Balkan complexity and flux, and we find few fixed bonds of friendship, but rather a kaleidoscope of fleeting combinations among petty rulers. To add to the complexity of the situation, one encounters a multiplicity of princelings, often apparently ruling simultaneously over the same city. They are constantly referred to by Spanish chroniclers as reyes or kings, but this European concept cannot be readily applied to the monarchies of Mexico. Frequently, the title of ruler is partly elective in nature, and equally, rule tends to be pluralized, with more than one lord for each people. But notwithstanding such apparent confusions, these communities enjoyed a common culture. They had in the main been subjects of the fallen Toltec realm, and as such, they shared the same cultural heritage. Part of this was formed by their religious beliefs. While each people tended to have a special or patron deity, the general pantheon was common to all, including the Mexica themselves. This comprised of a vast concourse of gods and goddesses, one or more of whom presided over every aspect of human life. Two of the most important and ancient gods were the rain god, who actually came to share the main temple in Tenochtitlan with Huitzilopochtli, named Tlaloc, and the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl, who performed a variety of important functions, having bestowed on man the sciences of agriculture and writing. He was also the god of the morning and evening star and of the wind. Having left Tula at its moment of disaster, he was reportedly expected to return one day from the east, and did, in the person of Hernan Cortez. Almost as significant were certain goddesses, such as Coatlicue, a kind of earth goddess and the mother of Huitzilopochtli, and the goddess of love, Tlazolteotl. To this deity each man had once to make confession toward the end of his life. She was also the goddess of excrement, the confession of evil things symbolizing the act of pouring out verbal filth. Love was naturally associated with the moon, and the goddess of love was also connected through the rabbit with the many gods of pulque, the sacred drink. These were often referred to as the 400 rabbits, because it was the rabbit who had discovered the pulque when he nibbled at the agave plant, from whose juice the precious liquid was derived. The connection between the rabbit and the moon came from the shadows on its surface, in which the Mexicans discerned the likeness of this animal. As in many religions, there also existed a divine pair of creator gods known as Tulord, Ometecutli, and Tulimi, and Tulady, Omecihuatl, who resided in solitary state in the 13th heaven called two place, Omeyocan. But as sometimes occurs, notwithstanding lip service paid to this venerable couple, they have been rather forced into the background by more gaudy deities. Their existence merely serves to undermine the ancient Mexican passion for duality. Among the Aztecs, we later find two principal priests, two merchant leaders, and in many city-states, two monarchs. Moreover, 2 is not the only divine number. 4 is of great moment. We shall be constantly finding examples of missions carried out by 4 ambassadors and ceremonies conducted by 4 priests. The number 5 is also of significance. There are 4 cardinal points, but 5 directions if the center is included as well, a concept equally familiar to the Chinese. Another similarity to Chinese thinking is that the cardinal points are identified with specific colors. The sacred 260-day calendar formed an integral part of Mexican religion, linking all the peoples of what is best known as Middle American civilization. From its place in this calendar, each day would be thus named after one of 20 signs, preceded by a numeral running from 1 to 13. Each child was given as part of his full name that of the numeral and day sign of his birth. According to whether this was propitious or the reverse, his own fate would be good, bad, or indifferent. For instance, 7 rain was good, and those born on that day would be merciful, pitying, and compassionate. The following day, 8 flower was equally propitious, but infants had to be quickly bathed and baptized, lest any part of the ceremony fall upon the succeeding day. 9 crocodile, described as perverse and full of vice. Anyone named after 9 crocodile would be exclusively dedicated to evil. One of his lesser faults would be a propensity towards slander and rumor mongering. So incapable would he be of taking care of himself that he would be destined to appear dressed only in rags and tatters. Bad days tended to outnumber the good in such an inexorable system. However, protection could sometimes be sought from the remorseless fate by the very simple device of postponing bathing and baptism by arrangement with the priest until the child could be named after a better day. Of the many migrant tribes, the Mexica were the last to arrive and probably the least welcome. Somewhat reputed for savagery, they were to be numbered among the less civilized inhabitants of the Valley of Mexico, although they spoke Nahua and practiced agriculture. They finally settled in Chapultepec, Hill of the Locust, at the end of the 13th century. They had not yet reached their promised land, but it lay literally within sight of this hill. The years spent in this place are an important period in the history of the Mexica. On their arrival, they were still principally governed by their priest rulers, the four bearers of the god, who had ordered their wanderings. The latter now continued to rule the tribe, supposedly inspired by dreams and visions sent by Huitzilopochtli. He was not slow in warning them against the temptation to settle down, telling them that before long they would be expelled. To the bearers of the idol called priests, he spoke, "My fathers, look to that which has come about. Wait and you shall see, for I know all this, that which will happen and come to pass. Prepare and make ready, and observe well that we are not to tarry much here, and that we shall go on a little farther to a place where we shall stay, sojourn, and settle. Meanwhile, let it be sung that two kinds of people will very soon come upon us." Meanwhile, they should await events, and he would in due time tell them what to do. Parallel to the priest rulers, the clans had their own individual chiefs. The number of such clans had now risen from the original 17 to a figure of 15 or 20. Their leaders are sometimes referred to as captains, indicating a certain military role. Since each clan had its own patron god, they also possessed a religious significance. The phrase military democracy has sometimes been employed to describe the government of the Mexica at this time, but it was in reality more theocratic than democratic. Neither democracy on the one hand nor kings by the divine right on the other have exact parallels in ancient Mexico. For the first part of their stay in Chapultepec, the religious leaders thus held effective sway. Probably because of external pressures, the government later devolved upon a single leader named Huitzilopochtli, Hummingbird Feather. In their present abode, hemmed in by greedy neighbors, collective leadership was eventually found wanting. In an actual fact, however, plural rule was more in conformity with local traditions, and many neighboring peoples continued to possess 2, 4, or more rulers. The Mexica, in choosing a single leader, were opting for a system more prevalent among the nomads and other peoples of non-Nahua origin. Nonetheless, as far as they were concerned, it was an important step forward. Plural kingship had obvious disadvantages, particularly for people nursing ambitions to conquer others. The new office of a single leader evolved largely from the power of priest rulers, but also in part from the original Huitzilopochtli, the human chief, later revered as a god. In fact, this new development may even mark the final establishment of his undisputed sway as principal deity. Chapultepec was a former Toltec stronghold, and it was here that the last Toltec ruler, a poor refugee, had hanged himself. Some Toltecs still clung to the locality, but they were few in numbers and had no ruler of their own. Chapultepec never lost its importance in Mexican history. On this hill, the Aztec emperors had their portraits engraved upon the rock. Here, the Emperor Maximilian made his residence, and here, in 1847, the naval cadets made their heroic last stand. As any visitor to the hill can see today, it has a commanding view over the city of Mexico and dominates the surrounding country. Appropriately, the castle of Chapultepec, situated in a fine park of the same name, is now in the National Museum of History. The Mexica, still an insignificant tribe, were in no position to make their mark in local politics. They had no friends and were definitely cast for the role of vassals and menials. As landless latecomers, they held a situation that was modest in the extreme. It is perhaps a mystery how they were ever permitted to occupy such a strategic site. In spite of their wretchedness, however, the Mexica were not slow to make a nuisance of themselves and to offend their neighbors by their antics. The Mexicans settled in this place of Chapultepec, and although it is true that they arrived tired, afflicted, and in disarray, After the long journey which they had performed, nevertheless they did not cease to multiply and increase in number, after the fashion of the sons of Israel in Egypt under King Pharaoh. And their neighbors, when they saw the growth in their numbers, began to be troubled and to make war upon them with the intention of destroying them, that their name might no longer be known upon the face of the earth, and that their kind might not establish itself there. Faced with such threats, they proceeded to fortify themselves as best they could. The Mexica were attacked and expelled from Chapultepec on two separate occasions. The first assault occurred in about 1315. It was occasioned by the arrival of Copil, the son of Huitzilopochtli's malevolent sister, who it will be recalled had been previously abandoned on the instructions of her divine brother. The Mexicans were then surrounded by innumerable peoples, of whom no one showed goodwill towards them, and awaited their future misfortunes. At the time, the witch with whom they had abandoned, Malinalxochitl, and who called herself sister of their god, had a son called Copil of major age. To him, his mother had revealed the injury that Huitzilopochtli had inflicted upon her. Copil was most grieved and angered at this, and promised his mother to avenge the ill treatment she had suffered as best he could. Then, when Copil received the news that the Mexican warriors stood on the hill of Chapultepec, he began to contrive with all the nations to destroy and kill that generation of Mexica, branding them as pernicious, bellicose, tyrannical, and of bad and perverse ways, as he well knew. Copil succeeded in his machinations, and the Mexica were defeated and driven from their home. He himself, however, was slain. His heart was cut out and was cast on to that very spot in the lagoon where the Mexica were to make their final abode. After he had killed him, Huitzilopochtli began to run with the heart of Copil. The bearer of the god Cuatlequetzli came to him and said, "You have endured much travail, O priest." The former replied, "O Cuatlequetzli, come. I have heard the heart of the villain Copil, whom I went to kill. Run and bear it among the rushes and reeds, to the spot where you shall see a rock on which Quetzalcoatl rested when he departed hence. Of his seats, one is red and the other black. There you shall stand when you cast away Copil's heart." The Mexica succeeded in returning in Chapultepec, but they were hard pressed and their second stay was brief. It was during this sojourn that they chose a single ruler, Huitzilopochtli, to command their defense. A few years later, in 1319, a new war was unleashed on them by a powerful combination. Doubts exist as to the prime movers of the Grand Coalition. It would seem, however, likely that the Tepanecs took the lead. As long as the kind of balance of power in the area had been maintained, the Mexica presidents might have been tolerated in Chapultepec. However, as the Tepanec strength grew, they must have coveted this strategic position so near to their own capital. No doubt they found ready allies eager to quell the upstart Mexica. A fierce battle took place behind Chapultepec, and a further massacre ensued after the Mexica had taken refuge in the lagoon. The unfortunate ruler of the Mexica was sacrificed in Culhuacan as behoved as a war prisoner. The main body of refugees found themselves in a pitiful condition, lacking even clothing. They eventually found their way to Culhuacan, where they threw themselves upon the mercy of the lords of that place. While the main body of fugitives had managed to cling together, some degree of dispersion inevitably took place, and certain Mexica, including many women, fled to neighboring cities. The surviving pictorial records provide illustrations bearing cogent witness to this tragic fate. The actual events took place 200 years before the conquest, but were faithfully recorded for posterity. The first, the Codex Boturini, shows Chapultepec depicted as a hill with a locust perched on top. By its side are pieces of wood, symbolizing the kindling of the new fire at the beginning of a 52-year cycle. Throughout ancient Mexico, two calendars were used. First, the sacred or ritual round of 260 days divided into 20 weeks of 13 days. And secondly, the ordinary year of 18 periods of 20 days with 5 supplementary days to make a total of 365 days. The Mexicans further counted their time in sheafs, consisting of 52 years of 365 days. Their system of designating these can be best described by one reference to a pack of cards. It is as if we called our years 1 of spades, 2 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, 4 of clubs, 5 of spades, 6 of hearts, and so on. The resulting combination of 13 possible numbers with 4 possible names or suits, the Mexican years were named House, Rabbit, Reed, and Flint, give us a total of 52 different designations for the years, after which the cycle starts again. In Mexico, the new cycle always started with the year 2 Reed, and its beginning was a fateful occasion. Below the drawing of Chapultepec with the symbol of the new fire ceremony, the same codex shows the people of the Mexica tribe weeping copiously. Farther to the right, we see the unfortunate ruler Huitzilihuit and his daughter in the presence of one of the lords of Culhuacan. All three are identifiable by the name glyphs above their heads, and the ruler and his daughter are shown being dragged by the hair, the conventional manner of illustrating war prisoners. The second source, the Codex Azcatitlan, depicts an even more dramatic scene. In the top left corner, we see the installation of Huitzilihuit as ruler. Below this is the glyph of Chapultepec, followed by a drawing of the lagoon full of tall reeds. Within it, the Mexica are seen struggling against their foes. Farther to the right, the ruler and other Mexica are being carried off as captives by the same peoples. Above is a picture of a warrior being sacrificed by the removal of his heart. The relevant year signs are placed beside the drawings. The Mexica came to Culhuacan as wretched suppliants. Their humiliation was so complete that they even felt forced to present their new masters the treasured banner and cloak of Huitzilopochtli as a sign of utter submission. Notwithstanding their present disarray, the arrival of this sorry band placed their hosts in something of a quandary. 2 of the 4 rulers tended to favor them, but a fierce argument ensued in their council as to how to treat the intruders. They decided to play safe, adopting an attitude of strict reserve. The Mexica were accordingly invited to establish themselves in Tiazapan, some 6 miles to the west of Culhuacan, near the present site of the National University of Mexico. It was far enough for them to be out of the way, but not so distant that a watchful eye could not be kept upon their activities. Moreover, they were dispatched to Tiazapan on the firm assumption that no one could conceivably prosper in such a wasteland of volcanic rock infested with snakes and other dangerous reptiles. But to the astonishment of their masters, they not only survived but actually thrived. Then Huitzilopochtli said to the Mexicans, "O my fathers, ask Coxcoxtli, one of the rulers of Culhuacan, where we have to go." Whereupon they asked Coxcoxtli and said to him, "Whither in truth have we to go, O Lord and King? For we know full well that the place is yours. Help us by the grant of a little land whither we may take ourselves." Then Coxcoxtli answered them and said, "It is well." Forthwith Coxcoxtli summoned his co-rulers, the Culhua, and said to them, "Whither shall they go?" The rulers responded, "O Lord, O King, let them go and stay there beside the mountains in Tiazapan." And forthwith they went and left them there to settle in Tiazapan. And those who had left them there informed the king, saying, "O Lord, O King, we indeed went to leave the Mexicans in Tiazapan." And Coxcoxtli said to them, "It is good, for they are no true people, but great villains, and perhaps they will perish there, eaten by the serpents, since many dwell in that place." But the Mexicans were much pleased when they saw these snakes, and they cooked and roasted them all and ate them. And then Coxcoxtli recalled and spoke to the Culhuas. "O Culhuas, go and see those whom you left, for perhaps they are dead." And they said to him, "It is well, O Lord, we will go and see them." And when they went there, they saw that they were making fire and smoke, and they said to them, "Have you suffered, O Mexicans? We have only come to see you, greet you, and inquire how you are faring." And immediately they answered, "You have done us a favor, and we are content." And the Culhua said, "It is well, now we will go." They went straight to the palace and informed Coxcoxtli, telling him, "O Lord, O King, we went to see them. They have finished with the serpents and eaten them all." Then Coxcoxtli said, "See what rascals they are. Have no dealings and do not speak to them." In adverse situations such as these, the Mexica would display a degree of courage and endurance which distinguished them from their neighbors. Far from yielding to adversity, they were spurred to renew efforts. Determined to survive in such inhospitable surroundings, they not only devoured the pests, but settled down to cultivate the fields and construct their temples and dwellings. Their nomad instincts had not entirely left them, and thus helped to make a virtue out of necessity. They succeeded in living, as they were accustomed, by a combination of agriculture and hunting, presumably adding to their menu forms of wildlife more appetizing than the snakes. In Tiasa-Apan, after the recent disasters under a sole leader, collective rule was restored, and the government again devolved upon 4 priests rulers. Tenoch is mentioned as the foremost of these, and he continued as such well until after the foundation of the new capital. The powers of resistance of the Mexica impressed the rulers of Culhuacan. According to another version of the events related above, it was suggested that if anyone could survive under such conditions, they must enjoy special divine protection. According to one of the envoys sent to spy upon them, already I told you that this people is specially favored by the god. They are bad people and of evil ways. Leave them in peace. Do them no harm, since as long as they are not provoked, they will stay quiet. From that moment on, the Mexicans began to enter Culhuacan and trade and deal freely, and to become related to one another, treating each other like brothers and kinsmen. This interbreeding is an important event in Mexica history and transformed their status by linking them with the oldest and most civilized of the peoples of the Valley of Mexico. No longer rude parvenus or intruding nomads, now become the Gua Mexica. It was they who were to be the upholders of hallowed traditions and who styled themselves the heirs by marriage of Culhuacan and thus of the Toltec Empire and of the Toltec rulers. Soon, the Mexica were engaged on their master's behalf in a war with the nearby people of Xochimilco. Culhuacan, in danger of defeat at the hands of this enemy, requested help from the Mexica. The latter naturally pressed for the provision of adequate arms, but were told that they would have to provide their own. Huitzilopochtli, as usual, stepped into the breach and instructed them to make shields out of reeds and lances from staves. Thus armed, they joined forces with the Culhua, themselves well equipped, and proceeded to battle partly in canoes and partly along the lake shore. The arrival of the Mexica saved the day, and with their homemade equipment they routed the enemy. They were ordered to take no prisoners. O Mexica, do you now know what I, the Culhua ruler, give you? That none of those who must go may take prisoners. Only shall we maim them, tearing their ears from one side of their head. And thus they did. Whoever took 1, 2, or 3 captives took away so many ears. When they had arrived, they informed the rulers of Culhuacan and piled the ears before them and counted exactly how many prisoners they had made. The Mexica, elated by their triumph, now began to put on airs and don fine clothes. The Culhua, far from being overjoyed at their escape, took fright at the military prowess of their vassals. One of the rulers of Culhuacan, who had always favored them, gave warning that if they did not escape immediately, they faced annihilation. Another story, yet more gruesome than the tales of the prisoners' ears, is told of their mode of departure. Huitzilopochtli, whose blessings were seldom those of a tranquil life, spoke to his people, quote, "We must needs seek a woman who shall be called the woman of discord, and she shall be named my mother or grandmother in place of where we shall go and dwell. Because this is not the place where we are to make our home and habitation. This is not the seat which I have promised you. It lies behind us, and it must needs be that our way of leaving our present abode shall not be in peace, but with war and the death of many. Let us begin to raise our arms, bows and arrows, shields and swords, and make the world know of the valor of our persons." Thus provoked by their god, they went to one of the rulers of Culhuacan and asked that he should give them his daughter as their sovereign and as the wife of their god. He granted their request, and the princess was duly carried off to Tiasa-Apan. Notwithstanding her beauty, so striking that she was likened to a precious necklace, she was promptly killed and flayed, and a priest donned her skin. Thereupon they invited her father, Achitomet, to take part in the festivities in honor of the new goddess, who was now to become the wife of Huitzilopochtli. He arrived, accompanied by numerous princes and nobles, and loaded with gifts. Meanwhile, the priest, dressed in the prince's skin, had placed himself in the sanctuary beside the god's image. Achitomet, as yet unsuspecting, entered the dimly lit chamber. He took the rubber, the incense, the flowers, the tobacco, and the food, and placed them before the fictitious god, the flayed one, in which honor he decapitated quails. And after this, as he offered incense, he lit the censer and recognized the skin of his maiden daughter, and was struck with horror. He immediately cried out to his fellow princes and vassals, saying, "Who are ye, O Ulwa? Do you not see that they have flayed my daughter? These villains will not stay here. Let us kill and destroy them, and they may perish on the spot." Immediately, fighting broke out as a result, and Huitzilopochtli said to his fathers, "I know well. Go from here calmly and cautiously." This story may have an apocryphal ring, like so many in the early history of the Mexica. Regardless of this, they had clearly outstayed their welcome and had become so sure of themselves as to commit acts of overt provocation against their former masters. The tale itself hardly shows the more attractive side of their character. However, it cannot be said too often that they were only the last of a long line of devotees of the flayed god. Like many deities, he was originally a god of vegetation, the dawning and shedding of human skin symbolizing the waxing and waning of the seasons. This god may lack an old world equivalent. However, one has only to recall the unhappy fate of Marsyas, Apollo's presumptuous rival, to appreciate that the practice of human flaying itself was not confined to the New World. This concludes Chapter 1.